Picture this. You're a United States Marine on a tiny Pacific island in 1944. It's 3 in the morning. Pitch black. Suddenly you hear the unmistakable rumble of diesel engines. Lots of them. Tank tracks clanking against volcanic rock. Your heart starts pounding because everyone knows what's coming. A Japanese armored assault. 44 tanks charging straight at your position. This is it. The moment every Marine dreaded. Going up against enemy armor with nothing but rifles and machine guns. But then something incredible happens. Something nobody expected. Your buddy manning the .50 caliber machine gun opens fire. The heavy rounds slam into the lead tank. And instead of bouncing off harmlessly like everyone thought they would, the bullets go straight through. Clean through one side of the tank and out the other. The tank slows down. Smoke pours from the engine. The crew tries to bail out, but it's too late. What just happened? How did a machine gun, a weapon designed to shoot down airplanes, punch through a tank like it was made of cardboard? This is the story of the Japanese Ha-Go tank. A vehicle that Japanese commanders thought was unstoppable. A machine that had crushed enemies across China and Southeast Asia for years. A tank that made its crews feel invincible. Right up until the moment they realized their armor couldn't even stop regular machine gun bullets. This isn't just about one battle. This is about how Japan sent thousands of men to fight in machines that were death traps. How American factory workers changed the course of the war without ever seeing combat. And how a simple piece of math, 12 mm versus .50 caliber, decided the fate of countless lives. Let's go back to where it all started. Japan in the early 1930s. The Japanese military had a problem. Their main battle tank, the Type 89, was pathetically slow. 15 miles per hour. That's barely faster than a person jogging. You can't fight a modern war at jogging speed. So in 1933, the Army Technical Bureau sat down and wrote out exactly what they wanted. A tank that could go 40 kilometers per hour. Something that weighed around 7 tons. Armor thick enough to stop rifle bullets and machine gun fire. A 37 mm cannon for the main gun. And most importantly, it had to be simple. Easy to build. Easy to fix. Easy to maintain in the middle of nowhere. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries got the job. The lead engineer was a man named Tomio Hara. He'd already designed tanks before, so he knew what he was doing. His big innovation was something called a bell crank suspension system. Sounds complicated, but it's actually pretty simple. It's a way of connecting the wheels to the tank body that absorbs bumps and keeps the ride smooth. Well, smoother anyway. Tanks are never actually smooth. By June 1934, they had the first prototype ready. They tested it in Manchuria and back home in Japan. The military observers loved it. This thing could hit 45 kilometers per hour on paved roads. Even on rough terrain, it maintained 25 to 30 kilometers per hour. It could turn on a dime. The turning radius was so tight it looked impossible for something with tracks instead of wheels. The engine was a Mitsubishi 6-cylinder diesel. Air-cooled. 120 horsepower. That might not sound like much, but remember, this tank only weighed 7 tons. The power-to-weight ratio was actually pretty good. And here's something interesting. Japan specifically used diesel engines instead of gasoline. Why? Because diesel doesn't catch fire as easily. A gasoline tank hit by enemy fire turns into a fireball. A diesel tank might leak fuel, but it's much less likely to explode. Plus, diesel was easier to get in the parts of Asia where Japan was fighting. The tank could run for 8 to 10 hours on a full tank. 34 gallons of fuel. That gave it a range of about 130 miles on roads. In rough terrain it was less, but still decent. Of course, nothing's perfect. During testing they found problems. The suspension pitched violently on bumpy ground. Imagine trying to aim a gun while riding a bucking horse. That's what the crew experienced. They fixed it somewhat by adding braces between the wheel sets. It helped, but the Hago always had a rough ride throughout its entire service life. In 1935, the military officially adopted it. They called it the Type 95. Why 95? Because of the Japanese imperial calendar. According to tradition, Japan was founded in 660 BC. So 1935 was the year 2595 in the imperial calendar. They just used the last two digits. Type 95. Now let's talk about what this tank actually looked like. It was small. Really small. 4.38 meters long. 2.06 meters wide. 2.13 meters tall. In feet and inches, that's 14 foot 4 inches long, 6 foot 9 inches wide, and just under 7 feet tall. An average height man could see over the turret. The whole thing weighed 7.4 tons empty. With the crew, fuel, and ammunition loaded, it was 8.1 tons. The armor was thin. 12 millimeters at the thickest points on the front of the turret and the upper hull. 9 millimeters on the roof and floor. 6 millimeters in some spots. That's less than half an inch at the thickest part. For comparison, a US quarter is about 1.7 millimeters thick. So the thickest armor on the Hago was about 7 quarters stacked together. Not much. But Japanese engineers had done their math. 12 millimeters would stop rifle bullets at combat ranges. It would stop regular machine gun bullets. Chinese forces didn't have serious anti-tank weapons. Soviet tanks at the time were lightly armored too. Based on who Japan expected to fight, 12 millimeters seemed reasonable. Inside the tank was cramped. 3 crew members total. The driver sat in the front left. He had a tiny viewport and a periscope to see where he was going. Next to him on the right was the hull machine gunner. He operated a Type 91 6.5 mm machine gun mounted in the hull. His job was to shoot at enemy infantry trying to get close to the tank. The commander had the worst job in the entire Japanese military. He was alone in the turret. Standing up. No seat. Just standing there for hours. His responsibilities were insane. He had to command the tank. Tell the driver where to go. Communicate with other tanks if his tank was one of the lucky ones with a radio. Only one tank in 4 had a radio. The other 3 tanks in each platoon just followed visual signals. He had to operate the main gun. A Type 94 37 mm cannon. He had to load that gun himself. Grab the shell, shove it in the breech, close it, aim, fire. Then do it again. And again. While standing. While the tank is bouncing around. While trying to see what's happening outside through tiny vision slits. Oh, and he also had to operate a second machine gun. This one was mounted in the rear of the turret, facing backward and to the right. So while he's doing everything else, he's supposed to also watch behind the tank and shoot at enemies approaching from that direction. American tankers who later examined captured Hagos couldn't believe it. How could anyone function like that? One man doing the job of 3? Standing the whole time? With barely any room to move? The turret had to be rotated by hand crank. No power traverse. Just muscle power. Cranking a heavy turret around by hand while trying to track a moving target while the tank itself is moving. Exhausting. But here's the thing. Against the enemies it was designed to fight, the Hago worked beautifully. Starting in 1937, Japan fought in China. Chinese forces had almost no armor. Very few anti-tank weapons. Against them, the Hago was devastating. The 37 mm gun destroyed fortifications. Blew apart machine gun positions. The machine guns mowed down infantry in the open. The speed and mobility let Hago tanks chase down retreating enemies and exploit breakthroughs. Japanese tank crews gained experience. They won battles. They gained confidence. They started believing their tanks were genuinely good. Not just good against poorly equipped Chinese forces. Good, period. This was a dangerous assumption. In 1939 that assumption got tested. At a place called Kokkin-Gol on the border between Mongolia and Manchuria, Japanese forces clashed with the Soviet Union. Now the Japanese faced real opposition. Soviet BT-5 and BT-7 tanks. These mounted 45mm guns. Better penetration than the Japanese 37mm. Thicker armor too. Much harder to kill from the front. The battles were brutal. On July 2, 1939, the Japanese 3rd Tank Regiment attacked Soviet positions. At first they had some success. Aggressive tactics. Surprise. They destroyed 32 Soviet tanks and captured 35 armored vehicles. But then the Soviets counterattacked. Soviet 45mm guns could punch through Ha-Go armor at ranges where Japanese guns couldn't penetrate Soviet tanks. The Japanese lost dozens of tanks. The lesson was crystal clear. The Ha-Go was outmatched by modern Soviet armor. The thin armor and weak gun weren't enough for tank versus tank combat against a peer enemy. But somehow, those lessons didn't sink in. Japanese leadership focused on better tactics and crew training instead of redesigning their tanks. And the war in China continued. There the Ha-Go kept winning. So the false confidence remained. When war exploded across the Pacific in December 1941, Japanese tank units achieved remarkable victories. In Malaya, Ha-Go tanks drove through terrain the British thought was impossible for armor. Rubber plantations. Jungle trails. They supported the rapid Japanese advance toward Singapore. British forces in Malaya didn't have significant armor of their own. They weren't ready for this mobile threat. In the Philippines, Ha-Gos landed with the invasion force. On December 22, 1941, north of Demortis, Type 95 tanks fought American M3 Stuart light tanks. This was the first tank versus tank battle involving U.S. forces in the Pacific. Both tanks had 37mm guns. The M3 had better armor, 32mm on the turret compared to the Ha-Go's 12mm. But at close range in jungle fighting, the Japanese had some success. They destroyed one M3 in the initial clash. These early victories reinforced everything Japanese tank crews believed. Their tanks were working as designed. Mobile, reliable, effective. They trusted their machines. Commanders relied on their armor. So when orders came to defend Saipan, nobody questioned whether the Ha-Go was adequate for the job. Saipan was different. Strategically vital. The island was only 1,250 miles from Tokyo. If the Americans took Saipan, their new B-29 bombers could reach Japan itself. The Japanese knew this. They fortified Saipan heavily. About 30,000 troops. Nearly double what American intelligence estimated. Among the defenders was the 9th Tank Regiment. Colonel Takashi Goto commanded it. The regiment had 44 tanks. A mix of Type 95 Ha-Gos and Type 97 Chi-Ha medium tanks. The Chi-Has were slightly bigger with 57mm guns. Better firepower. But they shared the same thin armor problem. The Americans began their assault on June 15, 1944. Landing craft hit the beaches at 8:40 in the morning. The 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions came ashore under heavy fire. Japanese artillery and mortars pounded the beaches from the heights overlooking the landing zones. By nightfall 20,000 Marines were ashore. Equipment and supplies poured onto the beaches, including M4 Sherman tanks. The Marines established a beachhead, but it wasn't secure yet. Japanese artillery could still reach the beaches. Counterattacks continued through the night. On June 16, the Marines pushed inland. They consolidated positions, closed gaps in the line. General Holland Smith committed reserves. Elements of the 27th Infantry Division came ashore. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito commanded Japanese forces on Saipan. He recognized the critical situation. If the Americans fully consolidated their beachhead and brought all their combat power ashore, dislodging them would be impossible. He needed to strike now before they were fully prepared. Saito ordered a major counterattack. The 136th Infantry Regiment would assault American positions. The 9th Tank Regiment would charge southwest of Hill 164.6. After the infantry attack started, the tanks would hit the transmitting station and throw the enemy into disorder. It was ambitious. A night attack, coordinating infantry and armor across difficult terrain. But it was their best chance. Colonel Goto gathered his tank crews. They did final maintenance. Loaded ammunition. 37mm rounds for the Hagos. 57mm for the Chi-Has. Filled fuel tanks. Checked track tension. Tested radios on the few tanks that had them. The crews were confident. Many had combat experience from China or earlier Pacific campaigns. They trusted their tanks. In the pre-dawn darkness of June 17th, the Japanese tank column moved out. Diesel engines coughed to life. That distinctive sound echoed across the landscape. Tracks clanked as the tanks formed up and began moving toward American lines. Inside each cramped vehicle, crews felt the familiar vibration and noise. Commanders stood in their turrets trying to see through the darkness. The Americans heard them coming. Marine sentries reported engine sounds from the north. Officers shouted orders. Men grabbed weapons. Anti-tank gun crews turned their 37mm M3 guns toward the sound. Sherman tank crews who'd been sleeping near their vehicles climbed aboard and started engines. Machine gun teams checked weapons and ammunition. At 3:30 in the morning, the Japanese attack began in earnest. 44 tanks. The largest armored formation Japan had committed in the Pacific. They advanced toward the 2nd Marine Division's positions. Some tanks carried infantry clinging to the hulls. The formation moved through darkness guided by the lead tanks. Marine riflemen saw them first. Dark shapes emerging from the gloom. Then came the sound. Diesel engines at full throttle. Tracks throwing dirt. The clank of metal on metal. Japanese commanders opened fire with hull machine guns, sweeping the ground ahead. Others held fire trying to get closer. Then something completely unexpected happened. Something that would change how Marines viewed Japanese armor for the rest of the war. Marine machine gunners opened fire with their Browning M250 caliber heavy machine guns. These weren't the standard 30 caliber infantry machine guns. These were 50 caliber weapons. Big heavy machine guns designed to shoot down aircraft and destroy light vehicles. The Browning M2 was a beast of a weapon. Designed near the end of World War I. Perfected over the decades since. It fired a 12.7mm round at over 2,900 feet per second. The standard ammo load included armor-piercing rounds. These were specifically designed to defeat light armor and fortifications. Test results showed they could penetrate 23 millimeters of hardened steel armor at 200 meters. At 500 meters they could still punch through 19 millimeters. Now remember, the Hagos armor was 12 millimeters thick at maximum. On the turret front and sides. On the upper hull. 12 millimeters everywhere that mattered. Simple math revealed the problem. The 50 caliber armor-piercing round could penetrate almost twice that thickness at close range. Marine machine gunners opened fire. Tracer rounds arced across the battlefield in brilliant orange lines. The sound was distinctive. The heavy boom 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 of 50 caliber guns firing. Gunners aimed at the tanks. Some didn't really believe their weapons would work against armor. What happened next shocked everyone. The 50 caliber rounds didn't just dent the tanks. They didn't bounce off. They penetrated. Cleanly. Decisively. At close range some rounds went completely through. In one side and out the other. Even at longer ranges the rounds punched through with energy to spare. Inside the Japanese tanks, crews experienced something worse than defeat. They experienced the horrible realization that everything they believed was wrong. The heavy machine gun fire wasn't just loud impacts on the hull exterior. It was penetration. Rounds coming through the armor. Inside the cramped hago there was nowhere to hide. A round that came through could hit the engine, hit ammunition racks, hit crew members. The armor designed to resist rifle fire offered no protection against 50 caliber rounds. One Marine machine gunner reported watching his tracers strike a hago coming straight at him. The rounds hit the front hull. He could see sparks inside the tank through the vision ports. The tank kept coming for a moment, then slowed, then stopped. Engine smoke poured out. The crew tried to bail out. 2 men emerged. They were immediately shot by Marines in foxholes. Another gunner on a half-track engaged a hago at about 150 meters. He fired into the tank's side armor. The tank turned toward him, exposing more of its flank. He kept firing. His loader fed another belt into the gun. He watched the commander in the turret slump forward then fall. The bullet had gone through the thin turret armor, through the man, and out the other side. A third Marine manning a 50 caliber fired at multiple tanks. He aimed at one hago's engine compartment, the rear deck where the cooling vents were. His rounds punched through the 6mm armor covering the engine. The diesel engine seized up. Cylinders destroyed by 50 caliber impacts. The tank stopped. The crew abandoned it and ran back toward Japanese lines through heavy fire. Japanese tank crews couldn't process what was happening. They'd trained for years. Fought in China where enemy weapons bounced off their armor. Faced Soviet anti-tank rifles at Kokkin Gol and survived. Their tanks were supposed to protect them. That was the whole point of armored warfare. The armor keeps you alive while you fight. But American machine guns were defeating their armor. Not anti-tank guns. Not artillery. Not even the big 75mm guns on the Sherman tanks. Machine guns. Infantry support weapons. Weapons mounted on jeeps and half-tracks. Standard equipment. The realization was devastating. If machine guns could penetrate their tanks, what chance did they have? One Japanese tank officer captured after his tank was disabled told American interrogators he thought the Americans must have some new secret weapon. Some advanced ammunition that looked normal but used exotic technology. He couldn't accept that a regular heavy machine gun could defeat a tank. In his entire combat experience, from training in Manchuria to fighting in China, small arms fire had always been ineffective against armor. Bullets made noise outside. They didn't come through. But the Browning M2 with armor-piercing rounds had enough energy to defeat 12mm armor at any range where a gunner could see his target. And the Marines had these weapons everywhere. As the Japanese tank attack faltered, Sherman tanks moved forward to engage. The contrast was stark. The hago weighed 7.4 tons. The M4A2 Sherman used by Marines at Saipan weighed 31.8 tons. Where the hago had 12mm of armor, the Sherman had 51mm on the frontal hull, angled at 56 degrees. This provided effective protection equivalent to about 75mm. The Sherman mounted a 75mm gun. This gun could penetrate hago armor from over a mile away. When Shermans opened fire, the outcome was predetermined. 75mm armor-piercing rounds hit hagos with devastating effect. Tanks were blown apart. Turrets knocked off hulls. Ammunition exploded inside. Japanese tanks that returned fire found their shells completely ineffective against Sherman frontal armor. The 37 and 57mm rounds bounced off or made small dents without penetrating. One Japanese tank commander whose hago was disabled by 50 caliber fire tried to engage a Sherman at close range. He ordered his gunner to fire. The 37mm gun fired. The shell hit the Sherman's turret face. Flash of impact. The Sherman didn't even slow down. It rotated its turret, aimed, and fired one 75mm round. The hago exploded. The battle became chaos. Noise. Tracers. Flashing lights. Disabled tanks burned. Japanese infantry scattered seeking cover. Some made it to marine lines. Close-range fighting in foxholes. Marine infantry found themselves with Japanese tanks rolling right over their positions. One Marine reported a Ha-Go leaking oil heavily soaked him as it passed over his foxhole. He stayed still until it moved on. Then jumped out and threw a thermite grenade into the engine compartment. The tank burned from inside. Another Marine had a tank roll over his foxhole. After it passed, he jumped out and jammed a coconut log into the wheels. The tank spun in place, unable to move forward. When the confused commander opened his hatch to see what was wrong, the Marine jumped on the tank and dropped a thermite grenade into the open turret. The tank exploded. By mid-morning on June 17, the Japanese counterattack was over. 31 destroyed Japanese tanks littered the battlefield. Some sources say 35 when including tanks hit by artillery. Perhaps 1,000 Japanese soldiers dead. Many tank crews. Infantry who advanced with them. For the Marines, the victory was significant, but grim. They'd stopped a major armored assault, but the cost was substantial. The 2nd Marine Division's commander later said if the attack had succeeded, it would have been fatal to the division. The battle had been close. But Marines walking among destroyed tanks afterward, examining them up close, learned a different truth. Japanese tanks weren't the formidable machines they expected. A Marine officer called his men over to look at a destroyed Ha-Go. He pointed at holes in the armor. Clean round penetrations where .50 caliber bullets punched through. Exit holes on the far side were larger. Rough-edged. Where bullets tore through after crossing the interior. Some holes were big enough to put your fist through. Inside the destroyed tank, the scene was worse. The cramped interior showed multiple penetrations. The commander's position had no protective features. No armor thick enough to stop heavy machine gun fire. The turret traverse was a simple hand crank. Gun controls were basic. Almost no space to move. The hull machine gunner's position was a tiny cubby with minimal visibility. The driver had a crude periscope and small vision port. Everything was cramped and vulnerable. Marines who fought at Guadalcanal 2 years earlier remembered seeing Ha-Gos there. At the time, with Marines having mostly light weapons and no armor support, Japanese tanks seemed threatening. But now, with proper equipment, with heavy weapons and their own armor, the Ha-Go looked like what it was. A light tank from the mid-1930s. Adequate for original design goals. Utterly inadequate for modern war against a peer enemy. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese tank crews was profound. Those captured had to face uncomfortable truths. Their tanks weren't just outmatched. They were obsolete. The equipment they trusted offered no protection against standard American weapons. Intelligence officers interrogating prisoners noted consistent patterns. Japanese tankers expressed shock at American firepower. They talked about the quantity and quality of equipment, the casual abundance of ammunition and supplies. Many felt betrayed that leaders sent them into battle with inadequate equipment while claiming technological parity. One veteran tank commander who fought in China since 1937 told interrogators he believed Japan would win through superior fighting spirit and devotion to the emperor. After Saipan, after seeing his tank penetrated by machine gun fire, after watching Sherman's shrug off Japanese fire, he knew spirit couldn't overcome material disadvantages. Training and courage meant nothing when equipment was inadequate. These reports were compiled and sent to commanders throughout the Pacific. The lessons learned at Saipan informed Marine tactics for the rest of the war. Japanese tanks weren't a serious threat. Standard infantry heavy weapons, particularly the .50 caliber machine gun, were effective. Combined with bazookas, 37mm anti-tank guns, and Shermans, Marines had overwhelming firepower. Word spread through Marine ranks quickly. You didn't need specialized anti-tank weapons. Your .50 caliber would do the job. This changed how Marines approached subsequent battles. The fear of facing armor evaporated. Japanese armor became just another target. Not a particularly dangerous one. Saipan continued for weeks after the failed tank attack. Marines and army troops fought across the island. The terrain was brutal. Flat sugarcane fields, swamps, volcanic cliffs. Mount Tapasho rose 1,554 feet. Fighting in caves and ravines consumed men and ammunition. The island was declared secure on July 9, 1944. Victory at Saipan had strategic consequences beyond the island. With the Marianas in American hands, B-29 bombers could reach Tokyo. The psychological impact on Japanese leadership was severe. Emperor Hirohito recognized Tokyo would be bombed. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo resigned July 18. For the first time, Japanese media admitted the war was going poorly. The loss shook confidence in ultimate victory. 4 Japanese tank crews across the Pacific, Saipan was a turning point. Word spread through military channels. Tank units on other islands heard what happened. They knew their equipment was inadequate. They knew American weapons could penetrate their armor. But there was nothing they could do. The tanks they had were the only tanks Japan could provide. Japan's industrial capacity simply couldn't produce modern tanks in meaningful numbers. Factories were strained by years of war. Resources were limited. American submarines cut off access to raw materials from Southeast Asia. Strategic priorities focused on aircraft production for kamikaze attacks and coastal defense for the anticipated invasion of home islands. Tanks were low priority. Japanese engineers had designed better tanks. The Type 3 Chi-Nu mounting a 75mm gun. The Type 4 Chi-2 with even heavier armament. But these existed mostly as prototypes and tiny production runs. Only 166 Chi-Nus were built during the entire war. 2 Chi-Tos. None saw combat. They were saved for defending Japan itself. Never sent to island battlefields where they might have mattered. Meanwhile, American production capacity was almost incomprehensible by Japanese standards. The Detroit tank arsenal built by Chrysler was dedicated to tank production. In December 1942 alone, the 5,000 workers produced 97 Sherman tanks. That was more tanks in 1 month than Japan produced in a typical year. The arsenal wasn't alone. Fisher Tank Arsenal in Grand Blanc, Michigan was another government-funded facility operated by General Motors. Fisher produced over 11,000 Shermans. Like Detroit Arsenal, Fisher could make hundreds of tanks monthly at peak capacity. American Locomotive Company in Schenectady, New York, converted from locomotives to build 2,300 Shermans. Baldwin Locomotive Works in Philadelphia produced over 1,200 tanks while maintaining locomotive production. Lima Locomotive Works in Ohio built the first production M4A1 Sherman. A tank named Michael shipped to England that still sits at Bovington Tank Museum. Lima produced 1,655 tanks before returning to full-time locomotive work. Pacific Car and Foundry in Washington. Pressed Steel Car Company in Pennsylvania. Pullman Standard Manufacturing in Illinois. Federal Machine and Welder in Ohio. All contributed to Sherman production. 10 major manufacturers plus countless subcontractors producing components. Tracks, engines, radios, optics, weapons. The industrial mobilization was unprecedented. The Detroit Arsenal itself was a marvel. Built on 567 acres in Warren, Michigan. The facility covered over 1.5 million square feet. Assembly lines snaked through the building for miles. Massive overhead cranes lifted complete tank hulls between workstations. The factory operated 3 shifts. 24 hours per day. 7 days a week. Workers included men who'd been automotive workers before the war, bringing manufacturing expertise. But also thousands of women. Many had never worked in heavy industry. These women, often called Rosie the Riveters, welded armor plate, assembled turrets, installed engines, performed every job except the heaviest lifting. They proved the nation's industrial capacity could multiply by tapping a workforce largely excluded from heavy manufacturing in peacetime. By the time production ended in June 1945, American factories built 49,234 Sherman tanks. Japan produced approximately 2,300 Ha-Gos over the entire war from 1936 to 1943 when production ceased. The ratio was more than 20-1. But even that understates the disparity. American tanks were far more capable individually. Shermans weighed 30 to 35 tons depending on variant. Armor ranged from 51 mm on hull front to 76 mm on turret mantlet. 5-man crews with dedicated positions for each role. Gyro-stabilized guns, allowing firing while moving. Radio equipment in every tank enabling coordinated operations. Reliability with tracks lasting 2,500 miles compared to 500 for German tanks and maybe 1,000 for Japanese tanks. The Sherman wasn't the best tank of World War II. German Tigers and Panthers outgunned it. But it was good enough and available in overwhelming numbers. In the Pacific, where it faced Japanese tanks from the mid-30s, the Sherman was overwhelmingly superior. 4 Japanese tank crews on subsequent islands, the pattern established at Saipan repeated. On Tinian in July 1944, 7 Type 95s were destroyed in counterattacks. On Peleliu in September 1944, Japanese tanks were dug into caves and used as stationary pillboxes. They recognized no chance in mobile warfare. On Iwo Jima in February 1945, Colonel Takichi Nishi's 26th Tank Regiment buried tanks in volcanic ash up to the turrets, using them as armored bunkers because tanks provided more protection stationary than moving. Even as static positions, tanks were vulnerable. 50 caliber machine guns still penetrated turret armor. Flamethrower tanks directed napalm into hatches and vision ports, cooking crews alive. Bazookas penetrated thin armor from any angle. The Ha-Go, once a symbol of Japanese armored might, became a death trap. On Okinawa, the last major Pacific battle, Japanese committed the 27th Tank Regiment. 13 Type 95 Ha-Gos and 14 Type 97 Chi-Ha medium tanks. 27 tanks total. The Americans landed with over 800 tanks. Numerical disparity 30-1. Qualitative disparity even greater. On May 4 and 5, 1945, Japanese launched a major counteroffensive to drive Americans off the island. Tank units supported the infantry assault. The attack failed catastrophically. Most Japanese tanks destroyed within hours. Knocked out by Shermans, bazookas, 37 mm anti-tank guns, artillery, and 50 caliber machine guns. Survivors withdrew, having accomplished nothing except adding more wrecks. In August 1945, when the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria, Japanese tank units faced another technologically superior opponent. Soviet T-34 medium tanks with sloped armor and powerful 76 mm guns vastly outclassed Japanese tanks. In the Battle of Shumshu Island, part of the Kuril chain, Japanese tanks defended against Soviet landings. Japanese had about 77 tanks, including Type 97s and some newer Type 1 medium tanks. Only 25 Type 95s. Soviets used 45 mm anti-tank guns, anti-tank rifles, and grenades to devastating effect. Japanese lost 21 tanks in about 2 hours. Soviet forces experienced in armored warfare from years fighting on the Eastern Front in Europe made short work of Japanese defenders. The experience of Japanese tank crews during World War II, particularly final years, was gradual crushing realization. What they believed about their equipment, about their chances, about competing with Allied armor was fundamentally wrong. The moment of truth for many came not in epic tank duels but in the terrible simplicity of watching machine gun bullets punch through armor supposed to protect them. For Marines who fought at Saipan and subsequent islands, lessons were different but equally profound. They learned Japanese tanks weren't serious threats. They learned proper equipment and overwhelming firepower made all the difference. They learned their 50 caliber machine guns were actually effective anti-tank weapons in the Pacific when engaging thinly armored Japanese vehicles. There was no glory in these lopsided battles. Marines didn't feel heroic shooting tanks with machine guns and watching them burn. They felt a mixture of relief, pity, and grim satisfaction. Relief they didn't face serious armor like their counterparts in Europe, dealt with daily against German tanks. Pity for men in those Japanese tanks sent to die in equipment offering no real protection. Satisfaction their weapons worked. That American industry gave them tools needed to do their job. After the war, surviving Ha-Go tanks shipped to the United States for examination at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. American engineers and armor specialists studied them carefully over months. They measured armor thickness at multiple points. Front hull 12 mm. Side hull 12 mm. Rear hull 10 to 12 mm. Turret front 12 mm. Turret sides 12 mm. Roof plates 9 mm. Belly armor 6 mm. They tested steel quality using metallurgical analysis. The armor was face-hardened, a process making outer surface harder than interior core. This technique was effective against small arms causing bullets to shatter rather than penetrate, but ineffective against larger projectiles with sufficient energy to break through hard outer layer and penetrate softer interior. They evaluated internal layout, taking detailed measurements and photographs. The fighting compartment provided barely 50 cubic feet for the commander. He had to stand constantly. No seat. No resting position. Turret ring diameter just 1200 millimeters, leaving minimal space for a man to work while operating weapons, loading ammunition, and commanding. Crew positions were cramped to claustrophobia. Driver had space about 2 feet wide and 3 feet deep. Controls were simple. Steering levers. Throttle. Gear shift. Vision came from small armored periscope and direct vision port opened in non-combat. Hull machine gunner beside him had even less space. Confined to small cubby with weapon and limited ammunition. American tankers examining Ha-Go's couldn't imagine fighting in such conditions. Sherman crews by comparison had fighting compartment over 150 cubic feet. Each crew member had defined position with proper seating. Commander had cupola with vision blocks all around. Gunner had telescopic sight and power traverse. Loader had space to move and access organized ammunition racks. Driver and bow gunner had adequate space and vision equipment. Reports confirmed what combat learned and math predicted. The Ha-Go was a light tank suitable for operations against poorly equipped opponents. It could function in colonial warfare. Police actions. Suppressing resistance where enemy had no serious anti-tank capability. It wasn't suitable for modern industrial warfare against peer adversary with proper weapons. Any firearm more powerful than rifle could defeat its armor. 50 caliber armor-piercing rounds didn't just penetrate. They overpowered armor completely, punching through with energy to spare. Internal arrangement cramped to point of being dangerous even without enemy fire. Commander's workload handling all turret functions alone was unrealistic. Lack of radio in 3 of 4 tanks made coordinated operations nearly impossible. Hand-cranked turret traverse was exhausting and slow. Vision equipment crude, leaving crew largely blind. Every design aspect reflected constraints Japan faced. Limited industrial capacity. Resource scarcity. Design philosophy rooted in experiences against inferior opponents. Comparison with American tanks revealed full extent of design philosophy differences. Where Ha-Go was cramped, Sherman was relatively spacious. Enough room for crew to move. Switch positions if necessary. Work effectively during extended combat. Where Ha-Go had thin armor vulnerable to machine guns at close range, Sherman resisted dedicated anti-tank guns at combat ranges. 51 mm frontal armor angled 56 degrees provided effective protection equivalent to 75 mm. Where Ha-Go had single-person turret crew performing multiple simultaneous tasks, Sherman had 3 men in turret. Commander focused on commanding using cupola with 6 vision blocks to maintain situational awareness. Gunner focused exclusively on aiming and firing using telescopic sight with magnification and power traverse rotating turret quickly and smoothly. Loader focused on maintaining high rate of fire, pulling rounds from organized racks and loading efficiently. Sherman's 75mm gun had muzzle velocity about 2,400 feet per second, giving effective armor penetration against most Pacific targets. Gun was stabilized in vertical axis, allowing reasonably accurate fire while moving. Capability Ha-Go completely lacked. Sherman carried 97 rounds of 75mm ammunition in protected racks, compared to Ha-Go's 130 rounds of 37mm stored loosely throughout fighting compartment. Communication capabilities differed dramatically. Every Sherman had radio, usually SCR-528 or SCR-538 set, allowing tank-to-tank communication and coordination with infantry and artillery. Ha-Go had radios in 1 tank out of 4. Other 3 followed visual signals. System breaking down quickly in combat when smoke, terrain, and enemy action made visual contact impossible. Vision equipment on Sherman included periscopes with replaceable prisms, direct vision ports with armored covers, commander's cupola providing all-around observation. Ha-Go had crude periscopes and small vision ports providing minimal situational awareness, forcing commanders to expose themselves, opening hatches to see what was happening. Every design aspect, from ammunition storage to crew comfort to fire control to communication, was better on American tank. But most telling difference wasn't individual tanks. It was numbers and industrial systems producing them. The United States built an economy that could wage industrial warfare on global scale. Factories producing automobiles now produced tanks at rates seeming impossible in peacetime. Detroit Arsenal alone in peak production month produced more tanks than Japan in typical year. Women never working heavy industry welded tank hulls and assembled turrets. Engineers constantly improved designs incorporating combat lessons. Supply chain delivered raw materials to factories and finished tanks to ports with clockwork efficiency. Merchant ships carried Shermans across both oceans to battlefields in Europe and Asia. Maintenance units kept tanks operational, cannibalizing damaged vehicles for parts, returning repaired tanks to combat within days. Japan never built this kind of industrial system. Its economy strained by years of war in China before Pacific War began. Factories lacked automation and mass production efficiency of American plants. Access to raw materials increasingly constrained after American submarines began sinking merchant shipping. The nation challenging the world's greatest industrial power was discovering true cost with each new battle. 4 Japanese tank crews on Saipan that early morning in June 1944, and for every Japanese tanker who fought afterward, the lesson was brutal and clear. They were obsolete. Their equipment obsolete. Their tactics developed for different warfare against different opponents obsolete. And there was nothing they could do except continue fighting with what they had, knowing survival unlikely and victory impossible. Marines on the other side learned different but equally important lessons. They learned industrial might matters in modern warfare. Having better equipment in larger quantities makes enormous difference. That courage, training, and fighting spirit, while important, cannot overcome fundamental material disadvantages. That factories back home in Detroit, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and dozens of other industrial cities were as important to victory as anything on battlefield. They also learned something specific and immediately practical. When you encounter a Japanese Ha-Go tank, you don't need to call for anti-tank support or airstrikes or artillery. Though all available if needed. You can engage it yourself with .50 caliber machine gun. At close range, under 200 yards, armor-piercing rounds will penetrate. Aim for engine compartment, sides, or turret. Bullets will go through, disabling tank and likely killing or wounding crew. The weapon, designed to shoot down aircraft and destroy light vehicles, works fine against Japanese armor. It was a small tactical lesson in massive war. But for men involved, for Japanese tankers who died in inadequate machines and Marines who destroyed them with heavy weapons, it was a moment of absolute clarity. This wasn't fair fight. This wasn't even match. This was modern industrial warfare where one side had overwhelming material superiority. Outcome never in doubt. The Ha-Go tanks on Saipan and every other Pacific battlefield represented more than obsolete armor. They represented the gap between what Japan needed and what Japan could produce. They represented impossible situation Japanese soldiers faced, ordered to fight a superpower with equipment never designed for that kind of war. They represented consequences of strategic decisions made years earlier, to prioritize naval and air power over ground forces, to assume fighting spirit could compensate for material inferiority, to believe early victories indicated long-term viability. When those first 50 caliber rounds punched through Ha-Go armor on Saipan, they proved something echoing through rest of Pacific War and into post-war analysis of why Japan lost. They proved in industrial warfare between modern nations production capacity matters. Design philosophy matters. Resource allocation matters. No amount of courage, training, or tactical skill can overcome 10-to-1 numerical disadvantage combined with generational gaps in equipment quality. Japanese tank crews who climbed into Ha-Gos that morning in June 1944 believed they were going into battle with reliable, capable machines. By the time sun set on June 17, those who survived knew the truth. They'd been sent to fight with armor so thin machine gun bullets went straight through. Given equipment adequate for war, Japan planned to fight in 1930s, but utterly inadequate for war, Japan found itself fighting in 1940s. And there was nothing they could do except continue serving, continue fighting, continue dying in machines that couldn't protect them. If you found this story as shocking as we did, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Hit that like button. And drop a comment below telling us what other incredible untold stories from history you want to hear. We've got plenty more where this came from.